Did you know the Vikings had a secret to staying alert and prepared done that involved a completely different kind of sleep pattern? Now, I know what you're thinking. Vikings and sleep don't exactly go hand in hand, right? These were warriors who raided, pillaged, and fought with ferocity. But let's get this straight. Their approach to sleep was so different, it'll leave you questioning your own bedtime routine. Stay tuned, because what we're diving into tonight is a history lesson wrapped in mystery and a hint of humor. Imagine this. You're winding down after a day of battle or hard work. The sun begins to dip below the horizon, and your mind starts to shift from fight mode to rest mode. Now, most of us would climb into bed for a long, continuous sleep, but not the Vikings. Oh no, they were far more strategic. That's right. The Vikings practiced segmented sleeper, fascinating custom shared with other cultures in medieval Europe. Picture this. They didn't sleep straight through the night. Instead, they would rest in two separate phases: first sleep and second sleep. Yup, you heard it. They'd sleep for about 4 hours, wake up in the dead of night, and then do, well, whatever the Viking equivalent of night shift tasks were. It was totally normal to wake up at midnight, do a little bit of housework, maybe sharpen a weapon or two, and then go back to sleep for another few hours. Does that sound like an odd routine? Maybe. But if you were a Viking, it was completely acceptable. No insomnia here, just a lifestyle choice. Imagine this. The first sleep would start shortly after sundown. Vikings would eat their last meal of the day, tell stories around the fire, or argue over whose turn it was to guard the goats. Seriously, how did that turn into such a heated debate? Then, it was time to crash for a bit. But around midnight? Oh, they weren't tossing and turning. They were getting up. Because, hey, being a Viking is no easy task. So, what were they doing at 2 a.m. while the rest of us were snoozing? Some were tending to the fire, checking the livestock, or sharpening their weapons, because nothing says, I'm ready to face another day, like preparing for battle while most of the world is dead to the world. But here's where things get a little more interesting. For some Vikings, that midnight wake-up wasn't just about chores. It was also about intimacy. Yep, the quiet, flickering firelight and the howling wind outside set the mood for a little midnight rendezvous. The Vikings even considered it an ideal time for romance. Who knew? But back to the sleep cycle. This wasn't just a Viking quirk. Segmented sleep was actually the norm in many pre-industrial societies. Without the convenience of electricity, light pollution, or smartphones, lucky them, people had natural internal clocks that synced with the rising and setting of the sun. It made sense. But, let's be real. Waking up in a freezing cold, dark Viking longhouse next to your cousin, who sounds like a bear choking on a log, and trying to warm up your freezing feet wasn't as romantic as it may seem. This was less about following a circadian rhythm and more about surviving a very cold night. And trust me, sleeping through the night wasn't an option in 9th century Norway unless you were willing to risk frostbite. So, picture this. You've just woken up at midnight. The longhouse is pitch black, except for the last flickers of a dying fire. Your cousin is snoring next to you. Your feet? Freezing. The wind outside is howling, and you've got an hour or two until you can return to that second sleep. What do you do? Well, my friend, welcome to the midnight interval. Now, this isn't just some random Viking tradition. It was the time between first and second sleep where all kinds of interesting, and, let's be honest, slightly weird, things went down. First off, food. No refrigerators back then, so if you woke up hungry, you weren't reaching for a snack from the pantry. You'd likely have some dried meats, smoked fish, or leftovers from the evening meal within reach. Midnight snacks weren't about indulgence. No, they were practical. After rowing a boat or dragging a deer across the frozen tundra, a little food was just what the body ordered. But food wasn't the only thing happening at midnight. This was also the time to reflect. In a world without light pollution, noise, or endless social media scrolling, the Vikings could sit by the fire, contemplate life, or maybe ponder if Odin would be impressed with their sword skills. It wasn't all heroic reflection, though. Many used this time to worry about the future, what was coming next, the day ahead, or simply the next raid. Really, it sounds a lot like us, doesn't it? And then let's not forget intimacy. Historical accounts and archaeological evidence suggest that this was prime time for romance. Couples often took this quiet opportunity for a bit of nighttime connection. The fire was already burning, you weren't tired yet, and well, there were no distractions. Who could blame them? Some even believed that the dreams from the first sleep were clearer, like messages from the spirit world. Maybe that's why the Vikings considered this the perfect moment for, shall we say, reconnecting? But there's more. If you thought sleep was just about resting, think again. The Vikings knew that life didn't stop just because they did. Villages were raided, livestock were stolen, and enemies, well, they had this annoying habit of showing up at dawn. So, when it came to sleep, particularly during war or travel, the Vikings didn't just snooze like the rest of us. No, they had a battle strategy for sleep shifts. In Viking camps or aboard their ships, sleep wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. While some slept, others stayed awake, constantly alert for danger. It might have been the shipmaster, a trusted warrior, or the unlucky guy who lost a dice game. But one person had to keep watch at all times, making sure the boat didn't drift into enemy territory or scanning the horizon for the telltale signs of enemy sails. And let me tell you, modern night shifts have nothing on Viking watch duties. Can you imagine standing guard in freezing rain with nothing but your thick beard for warmth? The Vikings sure knew how to multitask, and their battle-tested sleep shifts kept them alert and alive. So, as you can see, the Vikings didn't just sleep, they strategized. Their lives, both at sea and on land, depended on it. And while it might not have been the most relaxing routine, it worked for them. Just don't expect us to be copying their midnight routines anytime soon. Imagine you're a Viking warrior, about to doze off in the dead of night. The fires crackling softly, the chill air creeping through the cracks. And your clothes are still on, your sword within arm's reach. But you're not just asleep, you're always alert. Sounds intense, doesn't it? But this was the Viking way. There was no such thing as a peaceful, uninterrupted sleep. Vikings didn't just sleep, they survived while resting. And here's the kicker. They were so hardcore that even during their rest time, they were ready for battle. Forget soft pillows and comforters. If you weren't within arm's reach of a weapon, you weren't really resting, you were tempting fate. Now, let's paint the scene. It's midnight in a Viking longhouse. The wind is howling outside, frost creeps up the windows, and a smoky fire is still glowing in the center. You're surrounded by your comrades, each of them under woolen blankets, but hold on. They aren't even remotely in bedtime mode. No cozy robes, no taking off armor. They slept in their clothes-wool tunics, thick cloaks, and whatever they had on during the day. No time for relaxation. Why? Because in the Viking world, it wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. And here's where it gets a little wild. If you were a Viking warrior, you didn't just sleep in your everyday clothes. You slept with your gear on sometimes, even partial armor. No full chainmail, of course, unless you were extremely hardcore, but a helmet or a few pieces of gear? Definitely. Why? Because raids didn't give you the courtesy of a warning bell. Waking up in the middle of a raid wasn't a time to fumble around looking for your pants. It was time to grab your gear and get fighting. Not ready? Let's just say you'd end up in Valhalla a little quicker than expected. Now, let's dive deeper. The Vikings weren't the only ones with this sleep like a warrior mentality. It wasn't just the warriors who stayed ready. The whole culture embraced this need for vigilance. Imagine being a regular Viking farmer or craftsman. No matter who you were, if you were living in those harsh conditions, you stayed prepared. You slept in your clothes not for fashion, but to keep your body warm and ready for whatever came next. In a place like Scandinavia, the cold was no joke. A naked Viking? That's a quick way to catch hypothermia. But it wasn't just about clothing. When it came to sleep, Vikings were completely obsessed with vigilance. They treated their weapons like sacred companions, never straying far from them. Axes leaned against walls. Swords rested near their pillows. Spears, well, they were shoved under the bed frame if you had one. Everything in the Viking world was built around readiness. Even when they slept, they were mentally ready for whatever threat might come their way. To sleep too deeply was considered reckless. The honorable warrior stayed alert even in their dreams. Forget sleeping through an intruder. To do so would mean you weren't worthy of entering Valhalla, and you definitely didn't want to disappoint Odin. And when I say ready for anything, I mean it. The homes Vikings lived in were often isolated, made of wood, and highly vulnerable. Wild animals, bandits, or rival clans didn't care what time it was. They didn't wait for daylight to strike. The element of surprise was always lurking. And that's why these warriors kept their weapons close within arm's reach. Now imagine this. You're curled up in your bedroll, your cloak still wrapped around you, your weapon tucked safely by your side. The faint sound of wind outside is the only noise you hear. And suddenly, a noise. Something's outside. But you're not panicked. You're not scrambling. In fact, you're already halfway to your weapon before you even open your eyes. Why? Because you know that in the Viking world, sleep was a battle in itself. You had to be ready at all times. But here's the thing. This constant vigilance came with its price. The sleepless nights took their toll. Even though the Vikings took pride in this kind of heightened awareness, it was definitely exhausting. Imagine trying to sleep when you always had to listen for danger, when you always had to be on guard. It was the price of survival. And yet, despite the hardship, this mindset wasn't a chore, was a point of honor. To be a Viking wasn't just about your strength or your skill in battle, it was about your ability to endure. A true Viking wasn't just someone who could fight. A true Viking could survive the cold, the isolation, and even the restless nights. They were always prepared. So, as much as it might sound like torture to us now, this was simply how they lived. Vigilance wasn't a choice. It was life. And this mentality permeated every part of Viking society, from the warriors all the way down to the farmers. Whether in battle or at home, the Vikings made sure they were ready for anything, at any time. Picture this. You're a Viking warrior, rugged, unbothered by luxury, and more concerned with survival than comfort. Sounds intense, right? Well, that's exactly how they lived, sleeping on anything but a soft, comfy mattress. Let's face it, most of us expect our beds to be the perfect sanctuary at the end of a long day. But the average Viking, well, their version of a good night's sleep was much closer to a glorified sack of hay. Forget those romanticized portrayals of Vikings lounging in plush, fur-draped beds made of ancient oak. That's what Hollywood wants you to think. In reality, unless you were a Viking elite, you probably weren't sleeping in anything resembling luxury. For the privileged few, those high-ranking nobles or warriors there were proper beds. We're talking real wooden bed frames with intricate carvings and decorative hardware. Archaeological digs have even unearthed these beautiful pieces, often found in the graves of Vikings of high status. These beds were enclosed to keep the warmth in and the noise of snoring servants out. Imagine those cozy Viking fantasies, complete with curtains around the bed. That's the life of the upper class. But for the rest of the population, not so much. If you weren't a high-ranking Viking, you were sleeping on the floor, or a bench, or a wooden platform near the hearth. There was no such thing as a pillow-top mattress. Instead, you had a rough pile of straw, moss, or wool-filled sacks, if you were lucky. And if you weren't, well, you might have been graced with a patch of floor covered by old boat sails or sheepskins. Comfort was simply not a priority. Survival was. Now, don't imagine a bedroom like the ones we know. The longhouse was one giant shared space that doubled as kitchen, living room, and even a stable. No personal space, no individual rooms. Families, animals, and sometimes servants all huddled together in a human-animal heat sandwich. The closer you were to the fire, the better. Elders and the sick often snuggled up near the warmth, while kids and animals might be crammed in right beside them. Romantic? Definitely not. Efficient? You bet. But wait, there's more. Sleeping arrangements weren't exactly clean either. The notion of flipping your mattress every 6 months for a fresh night's sleep? That didn't exist. If your straw bed started to smell like goat pee, you just shook it out and hoped the fleas stayed on their side of the bed. But hey, it was better than sleeping outside or on a cold, wet ship deck. And here's the kicker. Vikings weren't after REM cycles. No, they were hunting warmth. They needed to survive the night without waking up covered in frost, or worse, freezing solid. So if you were a Viking with modest means, meaning you didn't own land, livestock, or a shiny axe, then you probably spent a significant portion of your life sleeping on dirt. And I mean that literally. No mattress, no cushy frame, just you, some animal skins, and a patch of packed dirt, hoping it wasn't damp or covered in goat droppings. Inside a longhouse, the floor was typically compacted dirt, occasionally covered with straw to absorb the messes. Sleeping directly on the floor wasn't a sign of failure, it was part of the whole low-maintenance Viking lifestyle. For the truly poor, this was their reality. No fancy benches, no wooden slats, just fur pelts laid out next to the fire and hoping for minimal hoof traffic from the animals. Now, if you think the worst part was the cold or the lack of personal space, consider this. There were Vikings who had to sleep by the doorway. Being by the door didn't mean you were highly favored. No, it meant you were almost outside, but not quite. It was a step up from sleeping in the open, but it also meant you were probably the first to get stabbed if anyone broke in. Sounds fun, right? However, there was a silver lining. Sleeping on dirt wasn't just uncomfortable, it was practical. The earth holds warmth surprisingly well, especially if you're pressed between a couple of other Vikings and a dog, and when your biggest enemy is the bitter cold, you take what you can get. In the winter, it was all about holding on to any warmth you could find. In the summer, it stayed cool, though comfortable would be a stretch. Survivable might be the more accurate word for it. But let's be real for a moment. Viking beds didn't come with back support, and there were no chiropractors to help you out. If you hurt your back, well, you'd either walk it off, or you'd become a bard, a lifelong chronicler of Viking tales. And despite all the discomfort, this wasn't seen as shameful. No, in Viking culture, toughness was admired, and any luxury was treated with suspicion. If you could sleep on the ground and still wake up ready to raid, then you were doing just fine. Now, if you value your personal space, silence, and the comfort of having separate rooms, the Viking Age probably isn't your scene. For most of these Norse folk, sleep wasn't an individual activity, it was a communal sport. Families, servants, visitors, and sometimes the animals all slept in the same room. It wasn't for fun, and it definitely wasn't for comfort. It was all about staying warm. After all, this was medieval Scandinavia. Winters were long, cold, and unforgiving. Imagine this. You're on a Viking ship, drenched, cold, and completely aware that comfort is as far away as the horizon. Now, don't get too cozy just yet. The Vikings didn't just sleep like the legends suggest. No, their sleeping arrangements were a whole lot less glamorous. Picture this. Unless you were noble or had a bit of extra wealth, your bed wasn't some luxurious, soft haven. It was more like a patch of dirt with some animal skins for warmth. Fancy, right? In fact, for the majority of Vikings, sleep was about surviving the night, not about comfort. Forget plush mattresses and soft duvets. If you were lucky, you had a straw mattress or moss-stuffed sack to lie on. If not, you were sleeping on the cold, hard floor of a longhouse with everyone else. And if someone decided to roll over into your sleeping space, congratulations, you've just made a new friend. But wait, there's more. The Viking longhouse was essentially one giant shared spacino walls, no privacy, no quiet moments. Everyone was packed in there like sardines, trying to make the best of things. The closer you were to the fire, the better your sleep was. But if you were stuck near someone's snoring uncle, or worse, the family goat, you probably didn't get much rest. Still, it wasn't about comfort. It was about survival. In a longhouse, you had to get cozy with your neighbors, because warmth and proximity were all that mattered. It's not like you had your own private space. Privacy wasn't really a thing in Viking society, not in the way we think of it. Your bed could be a wooden platform by the fire, or even a spot on the dirt floor with minimal space between you and your nearest neighbor, whether human or animal. If you thought a little cuddling was rough, imagine sharing your bed with the family goat. You weren't just bonding with your fellow Vikings, you were sharing your warmth with your livestock too. And speaking of livestock, the animals weren't just hanging out outside, they were part of the nightly sleeping arrangements. Seriously, Viking longhouses had a whole section for animals. Sometimes, there was a small partition between humans and livestock, but honestly, it wasn't unusual to find a cow in your bedroom, or even snuggling up next to you at night. And the reason for this? Warmth. Cows, for example, gave off plenty of heat. In the brutal Scandinavian winters, that warmth was basically like having your own personal radiator. Chickens? Not so much more chaotic, less useful for heat, but they still did their part by filling the room with noise. But this wasn't some quirky rural Viking habit. It was survival. These animals helped to keep the Vikings warm at night, especially when the temperatures dropped so low you could almost see your breath freeze mid-air. Plus, having the animals nearby kept them safe from thieves or the cold. It wasn't just about warmth, it was about pragmatic survival. Now, don't think the Vikings were naive about cleanliness. The Viking longhouses, after all, didn't exactly have indoor plumbing. The floors were usually just packed earth, covered with straw to soak up the inevitable spills, whether it was from soup or animal waste. The line between the kitchen and the barn was blurry at best. But again, in a world where the cold could kill you, cleanliness was far less important than surviving the harsh winters. But that's just it. The trade-off was worth it. Stay warm or stay clean. For Vikings, the answer was simple: stay alive. And guess what? Sleeping with animals wasn't considered strange, in fact. It was the smart thing to do. If you had a goat, a pig, or even a cow tucked in near you at night, it meant you were doing it right. You were maximizing your resources, keeping your animals warm, protecting them from the cold, and ensuring you stayed alive for another day of raiding or farming. Let's be honest here. Kids loved it. They got free heat and had the bonus of a living pillow. What's not to love? Now, let's step it up a notch. Imagine you're a Viking out on a raid, maybe heading out for a quick trade or a casual colonization mission. So, where do you sleep? On a boat. But let's make this clear. Viking ships were not designed for luxury. They weren't the comfortable cruise ships you see in modern times. Viking longships were built for speed, efficiency, and surprise not comfort. There were no cabins, no hammocks, and certainly no cozy little beds. Just planks. Cold, wet planks. And maybe, if you were lucky, a pile of sails to lie on, but don't get too comfortable. Sleep aboard a Viking ship was entirely dependent on the weather, the waves, and who was on watch duty. Forget a nice sleep schedule. It was about exhaustion. You rowed for hours, and when you couldn't row anymore, you tried to sleep in whatever position you could find, sometimes in your own sweat and sea spray. If you could find a spot next to a barrel of dried fish, or a guy with a leaky helmet, you were doing well. And if it rained, well, you just had to deal with it. There was no rain check for a nap. Imagine you're a Viking on a ship, drenched to the bone, hanging onto your gear, and wondering if this is going to be the night you fall asleep with your axe in hand. You're not looking for comfort. You're not looking for a peaceful sleep. You're just hoping to survive the waves, the wind, and whatever else nature throws your way. Because sleep on a Viking ship? It wasn't really sleep at all. It was more like extended blinking. You're not fully out, but you're not exactly awake either. Every movement of the ship, every gust of wind, every creak of wood is a reminder that comfort wasn't on the agenda. And let's not even talk about the smells. Salt water in your nose, the tang of unwashed bodies, the scent of dried meat mixing with the distinct aroma of sheep. You might think you've had a rough night's sleep, but try drifting off while someone sharpens their sword behind you and a goat is standing over your face. That's Viking sleep. Not a nightmare, just another Tuesday on a Viking ship. But here's the deal. The Vikings weren't in it for rest. They were in it for conquest. Sleep wasn't about waking up refreshed, it was about staying alive long enough to swing an axe when you finally reached land. The Viking approach to sleep wasn't about recharging. It was about surviving the storm and getting ready for the fight ahead. And dreams? They weren't just the random mishmash of your subconscious. No. Dreams for Vikings were messages. From the gods, from the dead, or maybe even some cosmic spoilers about what the future had in store. Viking sagas and epic poetry are full of dream omens. Dream of a ship sailing west? You're about to die. A cold wind blowing through your house? Also death. Wolves running through the village in your sleep? Definitely death. Basically, if you woke up remembering your dream, it was time to update your will and maybe reconsider that raid tomorrow. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Some dreams were visions, messages from Odin or Freya, giving insight into battles, harvests, or even hidden treasure. A good dream could boost your status in the community. A bad one? Well, Best keep it to yourself. No one wants to be the guy who wakes up and announces that everyone's about to drown. That's bad for morale. The Vikings even had their own dream interpreters, people attuned to the spiritual realm who could decode the meaning of dreams. But they weren't therapists. They didn't care about your stress over goat taxes or your worries about running out of mead. They cared about the symbols. Ravens, fire, ice, broken swords, three-headed oxen. The weirder the dream, the better. And dreaming of the gods? That was serious business. Dream of Odin? That could mean anything from divine favor to an imminent slaughter. If Odin appeared in your dream offering advice, that was good. But if he appeared in silence, wearing his cloak and walking away, well, it was time to start digging your grave. Odin was mysterious, even in his dreams. There was also the belief in dream walking, that your spirit could leave your body while you slept and travel to other realms. This made sleep more than just rest, it became a spiritual journey. You weren't just drooling on a sheepskin, you might be off battling evil spirits or seeking answers from the gods. Sleep wasn't a passive activity, it was a portal, an opportunity, a vulnerability. For the Vikings, sleep wasn't just about rest, it was about survival. Every night could be your last, and because of that, they prepared for it differently than we do today. While most of us might brush our teeth, change into pajamas, and maybe read a book before bed, Vikings sometimes put on their armor before sleep, not because they were paranoid, but because they saw it as ritual preparation. Before any battle, raid, or dangerous journey, a Viking warrior might sleep in their full gear. Chainmail on, helmet by the bed, sword ready not because it was comfortable, but because the gods respected readiness. To sleep unarmed? That was like showing up to Valhalla in your underwear. You had to be ready for anything. Some warriors believed that how you slept the night before battle could determine your fate. If you were prepared, if you were alert, if you were already in fight mode, Odin would notice. But if you were snuggled up, drooling on your tunic, and forgot your axe in the other room, you might just wake up in hell, the icy afterlife for those who died dishonorably. A terrible fate for someone who boasted about owning 12 axes. Of course, not every Viking had armor. It was expensive. But even the simplest folk sometimes slept in their travel gear, or kept their weapons closed the night before an uncertain journey. It wasn't just practical, it was a symbol. A statement to the gods. I'm ready. Let's go. But here's the twist, it wasn't just about death. Imagine this. You're a Viking, fully geared, waking up in the middle of a stormy night. The enemy's on the horizon, but you're not scrambling to find your axe. You're already ready, because your sleep isn't just restit strategy. That's the Viking way. Sleep wasn't about luxury or comfort, it was about survival. A well-prepared Viking didn't need to be shaken awake or change into battle gear. They were always readier, warrior in mind, body, and bedroll. And let's face it, if you were ambushed in the middle of the night, having armor already on was a tactical advantage. Imagine sneaking into a Viking camp only to find your target already half awake, fully armed, and prepared to fight. But that wasn't just a quirk of Viking culture. It was their way of life. When winter hit Scandinavia, it wasn't like it gradually came and it conquered. The snow fell like punishment. The sun barely showed its face, and temperatures dropped so low you'd be asking yourself why your beard was frozen to your chest. The cold was the true enemy, and during those long, dark months, the Vikings' activity slowed down significantly. And you know what that means. Sleep increased. The winter was no joke. The Vikings may have been the earliest practitioners of a kind of human hibernation, though not the biological kind that bears experience. It was more like a seasonal rhythmocycle of extended rest and reduced activity. In short, the Vikings slept a lot more in winter, and who could blame them? When the sun didn't rise until 10:30 a.m., and the weather outside was a frozen nightmare, there was no real incentive to jump out of bed early, especially when you were probably already huddled up, trying to conserve as much warmth as possible. Winter wasn't just about surviving the cold, it was about strategizing. Conserve energy, conserve food, and try not to freeze solid by February. Sleeping longer in winter wasn't just about comfort, it was a strategic decision. Moving less meant burning fewer calories, and that meant preserving precious food supplies. Why chop wood when you could add a few more layers of furs and sleep through the next blizzard? Many Viking families would stay indoors for days at a time, nestled around the fire, sharing stories and sipping mead, creating a sort of cozy community. Was it laziness? Number? It was adaptation. This extended rest allowed their bodies to recover from months of hard labor, long hunts, and constant war. Think of it like the ancient off-season, a time to rest, rejuvenate, and prepare for the next battle or raid. In fact, Viking sagas and folk tales hint at dream seasons periods when the people felt unusually slow or introspective, distant even from their everyday lives. Winter wasn't just downtime, it was almost a mystical season. It was a time when sleep, dreams, and spiritual reflection blended together. The Norse likely viewed winter not as a pause in activity but as a sacred season, when rest wasn't just for the body but also for the soul. But let's be clear, while some still had to keep busy guarding animals, fetching firewood, preparing food, there was definitely a shift. Winter wasn't the season for raids. It was the time for planning your next raid, recovering from the last one, and maybe catching up on some well-deserved rest. But not every night in Viking culture was about sleep. Sometimes, the Vikings chose to stay awake all night, and not because of insomnia or because their goats were being weird. This wasn't just about avoiding sleep, it was about ritual wakefulness. Yes, ritual wakefulness. Certain Viking traditions and ceremonies involved deliberate sleep deprivation. These were sacred nights when staying awake was a sign of respect, a way to honor the dead, to communicate with the gods, or to prepare for something monumental, often involving a lot of bloodshed. Take funerals, for example. It was common for mourners to stay awake through the night in a vigil. They'd drink, recite poetry, and share stories about the deceased. This was more than just a wake, it was a Viking ritual. Think of it like a Norse TED talk, but with more ale and the occasional axe juggling. These vigils weren't optional. You didn't just sleep through it. Staying awake was a sign of respect. If you fell asleep, well, that was like texting during a eulogy, except you might get an elbow to the ribs from a drunk cousin. But it wasn't just about showing respect. It also had a spiritual element. The Norse believed that the veil between worlds was thinnest at night, especially after someone had passed. By staying awake, you were opening yourself up to the presence of the departed, maybe even receiving a vision or two. Whether it was divine intervention or just too much fermented honey, no one really knew, but it didn't matter. It was a practice with deep meaning. Warriors also practiced ritual wakefulness before a raid or a major battle. They believed that staying awake all night was a way to mentally sharpen themselves for what was to come. It wasn't about getting rest, it was about focusing, meditating, and preparing. Some warriors even claimed to receive omens or visions while awake, sitting by the fire, contemplating their future glory in Valhalla. Then there were the seers and velvers, the spiritual leaders who often stayed awake for hours on end to perform rituals, chant spells, and interpret the dreams others had. They were expected to remain perfectly still, disturbingly calm, while everyone else nodded off into their porridge bowls. They didn't need sleep, they needed clarity, the ability to connect with the divine and interpret messages beyond the waking world. After all the ship raids, sagas, and stew-fueled storytelling, one thing about Viking sleep is undeniable. It wasn't about comfort, it was about survival. While modern people treat sleep like a wellness activity, the Vikings treated it as a practical necessity, a tool for survival, and sometimes even a divine appointment. When you think about Viking sleep, remember this. It wasn't about luxury, it wasn't about comfort. It was about surviving another day, staying alert, and doing whatever it took to make it through the night. For the Vikings, sleep wasn't some indulgent, cozy activity, it was part of their survival strategy. It was raw, real, and relentlessly practical. Modern people treat sleep like a wellness activity, a time to unwind and recharge, but for the Vikings, it was just another arena where they had to stay alive. There was nothing fancy about their rest. Everything about it was earned through months of hard labor, constant vigilance, and unpredictable danger. They slept in shifts because they couldn't afford to be caught off guard. They curled up beside their animals and family because warmth mattered more than privacy. They wore their clothes, and sometimes even their armor, into bed, because you never knew when someone might burst through the door with bad news or worse, a raid. For them, dreams weren't just random fragments of sleep. They were potential prophecies, glimpses into the future, messages from the gods, or warnings of what was to come. The Vikings viewed sleep not just as a body recharge, but as an opportunity to prepare the soul for whatever might come next. Every moment of sleep was intentional, sometimes for warmth, sometimes for readiness, and sometimes simply to prove they were still stronger than the night itself. Comfort, that came later after the raid, after the snow melted, after you made it home with both legs maybe. Then you'd get a bed. And, chances are, you'd still be sharing it with someone possibly next to a goat. But despite the harshness, Viking sleep wasn't bleak, it was resilient. They adapted to their brutal environment with practicality and a touch of mysticism. The Vikings didn't invent bedtime stories, but they sure knew how to turn their dreams into legends. Maybe that's the most Viking thing of all. They didn't romanticize sleep. They didn't overthink it. They simply did what needed to be done wrapped in wool, holding their axes, snoring beneath a sagging roof, while the wind howled and the world waited for spring. But now, let's shift gears for a moment. In the year 1480, the world was a little different. Rome, a city of incense, power, and a growing dynasty, was emerging under a new ruler, but not one of emperors. No, this was a new era, where the popes didn't just wield spiritual influence, they wielded power like warlords. And into this world, on the 18th of April, Lucrezia Borgia was born. Daughter of Rodrigo Borgia, a Spanish cardinal with ambition sharp enough to draw blood, and Venata de Catane, a Roman courtesan skilled in the arts of manipulation and connections. From the moment she was born, Lucrezia's life was wrapped in silk and scandal. She wasn't just any illegitimate daughter, she was the illegitimate daughter of Rodrigo Borgia, who would go on to become Pope Alexander VI, one of the most controversial pontiffs in history. The word nepotism didn't just apply to the Borgias, they practically copyrighted it. Rodrigo didn't bother to hide his children. In fact, he flaunted them. He installed them in courts, arranged strategic marriages, and played the game of political chess like a master. Lucrezia grew up in the Vatican's shadow, fluent in Latin, Greek, and poetry. Her childhood wasn't filled with playtime or toys. It was filled with political rumors, tutors, and secret ceremonies. She wasn't being raised for innocence, says, he was being raised to seduce alliances. By the time Lucrezia was 11, the rumors started. Whispers swirled that she was more than just a pretty face, that she was a weapon, a vessel of beauty and manipulation, trained to be married off to the highest bidder or the most strategic family. Her father didn't see her as a child. He saw her as key to unlocking power across Italy's fragmented city-states. But as Lucrezia grew older, the lines between victim and villain started to blur. Was she a scheming enchantress from the start? Or was she simply a girl being groomed by a corrupt family, with no choice but to follow the path laid out by her infamous surname? As she entered her teenage years, the world around her darkened. Rome was a cesspool of poison, spies, and daggers in the dark. The Borgia name became synonymous with seduction and betrayal, and Lucrezia was destined to be its most enduring symbol, often misunderstood, sometimes vilified. She had no throne, no army, but she had beauty. And in Renaissance Italy, beauty could be just as deadly as any blade. At the age of 13, Lucrezia was dressed in gold-trimmed silk and placed before the altar. The man waiting for her? Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pizarro, a man 27 years old, twice her age. But this was no love match. This was about leverage. The Sforza family was powerful in northern Italy, and Pope Alexander VI needed alliances, fortresses of power. Lucrezia was the mortar that would hold it all together. The wedding was a spectacle: fireworks, lavish feasts, and a carefully arranged union to solidify political power across the land. But this wasn't a romantic story, it was a strategic play for influence, one where Lucrezia was the prize. Amidst the gossip and grand processions, Lucrezia Borgia's life began to feel like a performance, a spectacle, with whispers hiding just behind the painted fans of Roman nobility. The wedding of Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pizarro, and Lucrezia Borgia might have seemed like a picture-perfect union, but beneath the festivities, there was a tension that no one could ignore. Giovanni was noble, yes, but he wasn't powerful enough to be useful in the world of high-stakes politics. Worse yet, as time went on, he started to feel disposable. Lucrezia, still a young teenager, played the part of the obedient wife, graceful, modest, deeply pious. She spoke carefully, quoted the Psalms with reverence, and appeared to genuinely care for her husband. But affection didn't matter to the Borgia machine. Within just a few years, Giovanni's usefulness had completely evaporated. By 1497, the political winds shifted. The Pope, Rodrigo Borgiano Pope Alexander Vino, longer needed the Sforza family. Giovanni, once a celebrated ally, was now a liability. The wheels of political strategy started turning, and the plan to annul the marriage was set into motion. Lucrezia was sent to a convent, allegedly for rest, but behind closed doors, her father, Pope Alexander VI, moved to annul the marriage on the grounds of Giovanni's impotence. Giovanni, humiliated and enraged, retaliated with the only weapon he had: scandal. He accused the Pope of wanting to dissolve the marriage so he could keep Lucrezia for himself. And just like that, the whispers began. Soon, rumours began to circulate about incest not only between Pope Alexander VI and Lucrezia, but also between Lucrezia and her brother Cesare. The gossip mill in Rome turned faster than ever, spitting out salacious stories, some too obscene to print, yet too delicious for the city to ignore. Lucrezia, barely 17, was at the centre of it all, not as a villain, but as a symbol. Was she a temptress, seducing men from the papal throne down to the lowest courtier? Or was she a victim of porn in a system that used her, then blamed her for the very plots that she had no control over? By the time the annulment was finalized, Lucrezia's reputation had already begun to blacken, not because of what she had done, but because of who she was. The Borgia name was synonymous with poison, lust, and betrayal. Lucrezia, at just 17, was beginning to understand just how trapped she truly was. But Lucrezia Borgia wasn't a broken woman. She was a dangerous, one stronger for surviving political betrayal, public humiliation, and the rumours that would haunt her name forever. Yet, as with everything in her life, her next chapter would be even darker, more tangled, and harder to explain. Shortly after the annulment of her marriage to Giovanni, Lucrezia took refuge in a convent again, but this time it wasn't just for appearances. It was during this period of retreat that a mysterious scandal erupted that would continue to haunt her legacy. In 1498, a child was born a boy, recorded in the Vatican's records under strange and conflicting circumstances. His name? Giovanni. Two contradictory papal bulls appeared, one declaring that Giovanni was the son of Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's brutal and ambitious brother. The other, marked Secretissimo, or top secret, claimed the boy was the son of Pope Alexander VI himself. Neither document mentioned Lucrezia as the mother, but the timing, her sudden disappearance, and the whispers of scandal made it clear. Everyone believed the baby was hers. But who was the father? Cesare? The Pope? Or someone else entirely, a mysterious lover named Pedro Calderon, a Spanish courtier who mysteriously vanished, most likely at Cesare's hands. The truth was buried under layers of lies, missing documents, and false accusations. But one thing was certain. Lucrezia's body had become the property of scandal itself. She couldn't even sneeze without Rome, assuming it was a calculated move in a Borgia plot. If the child was hers, she never officially acknowledged him. Yet, she didn't reject him either. Giovanni was raised at the papal court, first as a bastard, then as a nephew, and eventually as another pawn in the family's political games. Despite the rumours, Lucrezia continued to move forward, as she always did, smiling through the storms, refusing to explain herself to anyone. Her life had cemented her legend. Lucrezia became known as the beautiful poisoner, the incestuous temptress, and the seductive spider at the centre of the papal web. Never mind the fact that there was little proof truth had already lost the battle to myth. But far from retreating into shame, Lucrezia was being prepared for her next mission. Another marriage, a more valuable alliance. And this time, the stakes wouldn't just be political, they would be fatal. At the age of 18, in 1498, Lucrezia married Alfonso of Aragon. This was her second Mariaga rare moment when love seemed to be involved. But for a woman like Lucrezia, love was always complicated. In 1501, Lucrezia Borgia's life took another turn, one that would test her resilience like never before. This time, she would marry Alfonso d'Este, heir to the prestigious Duchy of Ferrara, in what would be her most dangerous and politically charged union yet. At 18, Lucrezia seemed to have found something resembling peace. Her marriage to Alonso of Aragon had, for a time, appeared to offer her something she had never known: affection. Alonso was a handsome, soft-spoken 19-year-old, a prince with royal blood from the Neapolitan royal family. Unlike her first marriage, which was purely political, Alonso wasn't just a placeholder. He was a prince in his own right, someone who could offer Lucrezia respect and, more surprisingly, affection. For a brief moment, Lucrezia flourished. Her beauty was the talk of the court: golden hair, pale skin, eyes that could shift from innocence to mischief in a heartbeat. She and Alonso were often seen strolling through the Vatican gardens, hand in hand. In 1499, they had a child, a son named Rodrigo, in honor of her father, Pope Alexander VI. It should have been a fresh start. It should have been the beginning of a new chapter for Lucrezia. But this was still the Borgia court, where love didn't last, only power did. Lucrezia's brother, Cesare Borgia, had recently married a French princess, aligning himself with France. Naples, Alonso's homeland, was becoming politically inconvenient. Cesare's ambitions required fewer connections and more action. In short, Alonso was a liability. The knives began to circle. Sensing the danger, Alonso tried to flee Rome, but he didn't make it far. In July 1500, he was ambushed by assassins while walking the Vatican steps. He was stabbed repeatedly, but miraculously survived the attack. Lucrezia, frantic, stayed by his bedside, nursing him back to health. She applied bandages with trembling hands, whispering prayers as her enemies loomed just outside the door. For weeks, she cared for him, trying to keep him alive despite the danger that surrounded them. But then, on the 18th of August, while Lucrezia was away, a masked man entered Alonso's room and strangled him in his bed, likely on Cesare's orders. Lucrezia returned to find her husband dead, the body already removed. Her grief was real and public. She locked herself in her chamber for days, refusing to eat and speaking to no one. The bright-eyed young bride had become a widow, and with her, the message was clear. In the Borgia household, affection was weakness, and survival meant knowing when to close your heart. Lucrezia emerged from this tragedy, colder, wiser, and more dangerous than ever before. She no longer trusted love; instead, she trusted alliances. And her next marriage would not only be political, it would be fatal. In 1501, just months after Alonso's murder, Lucrezia was once again dressed in regal silk, ready for another strategic union. This time, her marriage to Alfonso d'Este, the heir to the powerful Duchy of Ferrara, would be the grandest and most dangerous of all. The Borgias were climbing, and by marrying into the Este family, they would cement their position in the highest echelons of Italian nobility. But Ferrara's nobility had their doubts. Alfonso d'Este wasn't thrilled about marrying a woman whose family name was synonymous with poison, scandal, and incest. His sister, the brilliant Isabella d'Este, openly referred to Lucrezia as a harlot. Even Ferrara's ambassadors warned Alfonso against marrying her. But Pope Alexander VI sweetened the deal, offering money, land, and military promises to ensure the marriage went forward. Reluctantly, the match was made. Lucrezia arrived in Ferrara in 1502 like a queen from another world. Rome, with its chaos and corruption, felt like a distant nightmare. But Ferrara was different. It was a place of refinement and legacy. Here, the nobility prided themselves on courtly etiquette, education, and dignity. Lucrezia knew she was under a microscope. Every gesture, every word, every outfit was scrutinized. But Lucrezia didn't falter. She adapted quickly, wearing modest gowns, hosting refined gatherings, and earning praise for her charm and intelligence. Ferrara's court, which was initially icy, began to thaw. While her beauty was undeniable, it was her magnetic presence, a combination of wit, grace, and the resilience forged in the fires of papal politics that won the court over. Lucrezia began to cultivate a new image. She was no longer the Vatican seductress now. She positioned herself as a patron of the arts, a loving wife, and most importantly, a duchess worthy of the Este name. Her court attracted poets, artists, and scholars. She funded churches, hospitals, and public works. In Ferrara, Lucrezia carried herself with the cool elegance of someone who had seen too much and learned how to survive it. Though her marriage to Alfonso d'Este was politically motivated, the two found a kind of rhythm or respect than passion, but far from loveless. Alfonso valued her diplomacy, and Lucrezia had finally found a space where her intelligence and charm could shine without the constant shadow of scandal. Despite the political tensions and the dark legacy that followed her, Lucrezia Borgia emerged from the ashes of her past, transforming from a figure mired in scandal to one of power and cultural influence. Lucrezia's marriage to Alfonso d'Este seemed to bring some much-needed peace. Though their union was political, their relationship was respectful, with more diplomacy than passion, but far from loveless. Alfonso valued her intelligence and diplomacy, and in time they would raise several children together. But even as Lucrezia settled into her role as Duchess of Ferrara, the shadows of Rome never fully left her. With her father, Pope Alexander VI, still holding power, and her brother, Cesare, still carving a bloody path through Italy, the Borgia legacy continued to haunt her steps. Ferrara, however, offered a semblance of peace, a respite that Lucrezia knew better than to trust. In the grand halls of Ferrara, she played the beautiful Duchess, but her heart remained tethered to Rome, where the mighty Borgia dynasty was beginning to crumble. In 1503, Lucrezia's world shifted violently. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, the man who had raised her as both a daughter and a political instrument, suddenly fell ill after a banquet. Within days, he was dead. His body bloated, blackened, and leaked foul fluids. The rumours spread like wildfire. Some whispered that he had been poisoned, possibly by Cesare himself in a botched plot. Others claimed that the devil had come to collect a soul too wicked for either heaven or hell. Whatever the truth, his death marked the beginning of the end for the Borgia. Lucrezia received the news with composed sorrow, but she knew what it meant. The leash that had once held her enemies in check had snapped. Worse still, her brother Cesare, once the terror of the Italian peninsula, was ill, weakened by syphilis, and rapidly losing his grip on power. With the new pope uninterested in Borgia affairs, Cesare's enemies rallied against him. In Rome, the Borgia palaces were looted. Loyal allies were executed. Streets that once echoed with the Borgia triumphs now spat on their memory. Cesare, unable to hold what he had conquered, was forced to flee and eventually imprisoned. For a brief moment, the once feared house of Borgia vanished from the map. And Lucrezia? She did the unthinkable. She remained silent. She did not fight to restore her family. She did not ride south to help Cesare. Instead, she closed the gates of Ferrara and focused inward. Many saw it as betrayal, but Lucrezia knew that survival demanded distance. Her power now depended not on the Borgias, but on being a true Este Duchess. Her past was poison. Her future had to be clean. Still, Lucrezia grieved in private. Her letters reveal a woman torn between worlds, mourning her father and brother, yet fearful of what their legacy might do to her children's future. With the collapse of her family, Lucrezia had a choice: cling to the ashes of the past, or build something new from them. She chose the latter. She would no longer be the daughter of the Pope. She would become the Duchess who outlived her name. With the fall of the Borgia dynasty behind her, and the chaos of Rome replaced by the Order of Ferrara, Lucrezia Borgia began her most surprising transformation, not into a queen of scandal, but into a queen of culture. No longer tethered to Vatican schemes, Lucrezia turned her energy toward building a court unlike any other in northern Italy. She invited humanists, poets, theologians, and artists to Ferrara, transforming the duchy into a glittering beacon of Renaissance thought. Her salons became legendary, places where philosophy, music, and politics mixed with elegance and a hint of rebellion. Lucrezia became a patron of the arts, commissioning paintings and plays, and writing poetry of her own. Among those who passed through her orbit were Ariosto and Bembo, two men who captured her wit and beauty in immortal verse. Bembo, in particular, fell deeply in love with her. Their correspondence, filled with longing and literary flair, reveals a Lucrezia who was intellectually curious, emotionally complex, and very much in control of her public image. Yet behind the art and refinement was a woman still navigating a dangerous court. Life in Ferrara wasn't without its enemies. Some nobles still whispered that she was a Borgia witch in disguise. Others resented her growing influence over Duke Alfonso. But Lucrezia countered their disdain with impeccable diplomacy. She made strategic charitable donations, championed religious causes, and hosted lavish public festivals to win the hearts of her subjects. Motherhood, too, became a new focus. Lucrezia bore several children, though not all survived infancy. She lavished attention on their education and futures, especially Rodrigo, her eldest son, whose birth had been shrouded in scandal. In Ferrara, she could shape her legacy. She had finally carved out a space for herself, far from the scandal, yet firmly in control of her fate. Motherhood, for Lucrezia Borgia, became a new chapter in her life, one that focused on legacy, love, and survival, but it was still bound to the shadow of her past. Despite the political storms of her early life, Lucrezia found solace in her children. She bore several children, though not all survived infancy. She lavished attention on their education and futures, particularly Rodrigo, her son with Alonso of Aragon, whose birth had been shrouded in scandal. In Ferrara, she tried to secure his future with titles and affection, though he remained an uncomfortable reminder of her turbulent past. But perhaps most notably, Lucrezia used her position to mediate between warring Italian factions. She wrote letters to kings and popes, offering peace proposals and calming tensions. Slowly, some began to see her, not as the former pawn of the papacy, but as a ruler in her own right, a duchess who wielded power with grace and diplomacy. By 1510, Lucrezia Borgia was no longer just surviving. She was thriving as a duchess, a mother, a patron, and perhaps finally as her own woman. However, peace in Renaissance Italy was always a brief illusion, and the shadows of the past never truly left her. As the golden glow of Ferrara's Renaissance court shimmered outward within Lucrezia's private world, darkness returned, quietly, relentlessly. In the years following her cultural triumphs, tragedy struck her family like a slow, choking tide. Her beloved son, Rodrigo, the child born of her marriage to Alonso of Aragon, died in 1512 at just 13 years old. The boy had been her pride, her living proof that love once existed in her tumultuous life. His death shattered her. Friends wrote of Lucrezia retreating from court. Her bright presence dimmed, her joy hollowed out. She wore mourning clothes for months, and her letters became darker, more fatalistic. But the sorrow didn't end there. She would lose multiple children in infancy, tiny lives that barely drew breath before vanishing into prayer books and tombs. Each loss left her body weakened, her spirit more burdened. Still, she endured, keeping her pain tightly wound behind the poised mask of a duchess. Publicly, she smiled at festivals. Privately, she confessed to spiritual torment, guilt, and dread. But there were the persistent the stories of her past. The poisoned goblets, the incestuous accusations, the secret baby that never truly left her. No matter how many chapels she built, or artists she supported, there were always those who muttered Borgia with narrowed eyes. Her efforts at redemption often felt like trying to scrub ink from a parchment the stain wouldn't leave. Even her marriage to Alfonso d'Este, once respectful but never romantic, began to grow strained. Alfonso was often away on military campaigns, and Lucrezia began to take more interest in religion and mysticism. She fasted frequently, commissioned sacred art, and poured money into monasteries. Some said she was atoning for sins she never confessed. Others believed she was preparing for something darker. Her health, already weakened by repeated childbirths and the immense stress of her life, began to fail. She suffered from fevers, exhaustion, and melancholia. By 1518, even climbing the stairs became difficult. Yet, through it all, she kept writing, kept mediating, kept protecting her children, and preserving the Ferrara court's splendor. It was as if she knew time was running out and she wanted to leave behind something beautiful, something that would outshine the scandals. But history is a jealous scribe, and for Lucrezia Borgia, the final chapter was already being inked. In the winter of 1519, Lucrezia lay in bed, pale and worn, her strength fading with each breath. She was just 39, but her body bore the weight of more than a dozen pregnancies, years of courtly performance, and the relentless shadow of a family name that never let her go. She had fallen ill after giving birth to her final child, a daughter who died within hours. The labor had been brutal, and infection set in quickly. Ferrara's finest physicians hovered helplessly, but the Duchess already seemed to know her fate. Her letters turned mournful. She confessed her soul to the heavens. She asked for prayers, not pity. On the 24th of June, 1519, Lucrezia Borgia died. The city of Ferrara mourned deeply. Bells rang across the duchy, convents held vigils, and courtiers wept. The woman who had once been scorned as the Vatican serpent was now mourned as a noble, wise, and compassionate duchess. Alfonso d'Este, often distant in life, grieved her sincerely. Her children, especially the ones old enough to understand, remembered her as a devoted mother, gentle, careful, and fiercely protective. But outside Ferrara, the myth reasserted itself. Rome remembered the younger Lucreziati girl caught in a web of power, scandal, and whispered poison. Pamphlets and stories revived the old rumors that she had seduced cardinals, murdered husbands, and even more. And so, the myth of Lucrezia Borgia endured. Whispers followed her from the Vatican's shadow to the court of Ferrara, where they would never truly fade. The rumors persisted that she had poisoned rivals, seduced cardinals, and slept with her brother. Despite much of this being political slander, the Borgia brand had long been tainted, and Lucrezia had carried its burden to the grave. Yet, beneath the scandalous myth, a quieter truth endured. Lucrezia Borgia had never been a schemer. She had been a survivor, a girl traded like coin by powerful men, who eventually learned to shape her own court, culture, and legacy. She was a woman who turned scandal into strategy and disgrace into dignity. She left behind poems, letters, and architecture pieces of herself scattered across the Italian Renaissance. In time, historians would begin to re-examine her story. Was she a villain, a victim, or both? Perhaps she was something rare, a woman who lived in a time that had no room for her complexity. And in that way, Lucrezia Borgia became more than just a daughter of a pope. She became a mirror, reflecting the sins, fears, and brilliance of an age that still hasn't quite forgiven her for surviving it. Now, let's turn to another figure whose legacy, though less surrounded by scandal, would leave its own indelible mark on history. Richard Plantagenet was born on the 8th of September, 1157, in Oxford, into a world of power struggles and dynastic ambition. His father was King Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet kings, a ruler known for his terrifying energy and legal genius. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was a woman of unparalleled influence, once Queen of France, then Queen of England, and forever a political storm in her own right. From birth, Richard was not raised to be merely English. He was raised to be powerful. He grew up not in the mists of Britain, but in the sun-drenched courts of Aquitaine, his mother's duchy in southern France. Here, he absorbed not just the language and chivalry of the region, but its intense pride and martial culture. He preferred speaking Languedoc over English, and would always identify more as a French duke than an English prince. Unlike his older brother Henry, the young king, Richard wasn't coddled with ceremony. He was taught to lead armies. By the time he was just 12, he was already training with knights. By 15, he was riding in full armor, jousting, and studying the military campaigns of Julius Caesar. He was tall, charismatic, and terrifyingly brave. It was clear early on that this boy wasn't made to sit on thrones. He was made to seize them. But Richard's youth was soaked in family betrayal. His father's paranoia, his mother's ambition, and the bitter rivalries between his brothers. This created a toxic brew of loyalty and rebellion. In 1173, when Richard was just 16, he joined a rebellion against his own father, led by his mother and elder brother. They claimed Henry was denying them power, titles, and land. It was a bold, dangerous move. Richard, barely out of boyhood, rode into war, not against foreign enemies, but against his own blood. The rebellion failed. Eleanor was imprisoned, and Richard was forced to kneel before his father, begging for forgiveness. But Henry saw something in him: fire, audacity, and skill. He forgave Richard, but kept a wary eye. By the time Richard reached adulthood, he had already tasted both rebellion and redemption. He had learned that thrones were never inherited peacefully. They were earned with blood, strategy, and fear. And Richard was just getting started. Richard transformed from a rebellious prince into a battle-hardened warlord. His reign over Aquitaine was one marked not by diplomacy but by brutality. Richard was merciless in his approach to governance. Cities that defied him were burned, castles razed, and nobles who dared to rise up were either exiled or executed. He ruled Aquitaine not with charm, but with steel. It was here that he earned his legendary epithet, Coeur de Lion the Lionheart. His courage on the battlefield was undeniable. He led the charge in every battle, fought hand to hand, and was rumoured to be the strongest knight in his own court. His ferocity became legend, as did his temper and vanity. Richard did not forget slights. He ruled not as a just king but as a feared warrior. His relationship with his family soured during these years. He and his brothers, Geoffrey and John, vied constantly for their father's approval and territories. King Henry II, sensing Richard's growing ambition, became increasingly fearful of him. The tension between father and son became so great that it nearly led to civil war more than once. Then, in 1183, fate took a dramatic turn. Henry the young king, Richard's older brother and the presumed heir to the English throne, died suddenly of dysentery while campaigning. With his death, Richard became the heir to the throne. But Henry II, still unable to trust him, tried to force Richard to hand over Aquitaine to his youngest brother John. Richard refused. Tensions snapped again. In 1187, with Eleanor of Aquitaine still imprisoned, she was briefly released to mediate. But the final break came in 1189, when Richard did the unthinkable. He allied with King Philip II of France, his father's longtime enemy. Together, they attacked Henry's territories in France. The aging king, sick, tired, and betrayed by his favourite son, was finally broken. When Henry died shortly after, Richard became King of England, Duke of Normandy, and Count of Anjou. But his crown wasn't forged in Westminster, it was forged in rebellion, fire, and the ashes of a father's broken heart. In 1189, when Richard I ascended to the throne, the people celebrated. He was just 31, tall, golden-haired, and already a living legend. But what they didn't know was that Richard wasn't interested in governing. He had no passion for tax reform, justice, or domestic policy. To him, England wasn't a homeland, it was a bank. Richard had one obsession: the crusade. Years earlier, Richard had vowed to take the cross, inspired by tales of Jerusalem's fall and the growing fame of Saladin, the great Muslim leader who had reclaimed the holy city. For Richard, this wasn't just a war. This was his divine purposer, chance to prove himself not just as a king but as a holy warrior, God's chosen champion. So, he did what he had, till he sold everything that wasn't nailed down. He drained the royal treasury, imposed massive taxes, and sold titles, lands, and offices. Infamously, he declared he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. Richard even ransomed prisoners and pardoned criminals for coin. The money went directly into funding his crusade ships, armour, and mercenaries. Within a year, he had transformed England into a crusader's launchpad, but England itself was left behind. Richard appointed a government in his absence, with his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, as regent, and his ambitious but dangerous brother, John, left with minimal power. For now, the people hoped Richard would return soon. But Richard would not. In 1190, he sailed for the Third Crusade, alongside King Philip of France, his former ally, who would soon become his bitter rival. Their first stop was Sicily, where Richard immediately found himself embroiled in a power struggle between rivals. The stage was set for Richard's legendary journey across the Mediterranean, a journey that would not only shape his reign, but the course of history. Richard the Lionheart was not just a crusader, he was a conqueror, a king of war, and a man whose ambition could never be satisfied. As Richard's fleet sailed onward toward the Holy Land, the storm had scattered them across the Mediterranean, throwing his journey into chaos. One of his ships, carrying his sister Joan and his future bride Berengaria of Navarre, was shipwrecked on the island of Cyprus. The local ruler, Isaac Komnenos, a rogue Byzantine prince, made a fatal mistake. He refused to release Richard's royal passengers and looted the survivors. That was all the excuse the Lionheart needed. Richard landed on Cyprus with cold fury. Within days, he had conquered the island. It was a swift and brutal campaign. Castles were taken, and Isaac was captured famously bound in silver chains because Richard had promised not to use iron. The conquest of Cyprus shocked everyone. Richard hadn't even reached the Holy Land yet, and had already added an island to his possessions. Amidst the chaos of war, Richard did something unexpected. He got married. On May 12th, 1191, Richard married Berengaria of Navarre in Limassol, Cyprus. The wedding was a grand spectacle. The church was decked in silk, with nobles and knights bearing witness. But the marriage was cold from the start. Berengaria was quiet, pious, and politically useful, but she would never be close to Richard's heart. In fact, she would spend most of their married life far from him. This entire chapter storm, conquest, and wedding perfectly captured Richard's character. He could pivot from crusader to conqueror to groom in a single month. Always bold, always theatrical, and always hungry for action. But while Cyprus had fallen into his lap, his alliance with Philip of France was falling apart. Philip, who had grown envious of Richard's fame, charisma, and perhaps his ability to overshadow him, felt the pressure building. Tensions reached a breaking point when Richard refused to marry Philip's sister, Alice, with whom he had been betrothed for years. He had allegedly seduced and discarded her. Philip, humiliated, returned to France, leaving Richard to face Saladin alone. And Richard didn't mind. In fact, he preferred it that way no rivals, no politics, just war. With Cyprus conquered and his bride safely married, Richard finally turned his fleet toward the shores of the Levant. The Lionheart had arrived in the Holy Land, and the real war was about to begin. By the time Richard arrived in the Holy Land in June 1191, the siege of Acre had already dragged on for nearly 2 years. Crusader forces had surrounded the coastal city, but Saladin's defenders were holding firm. The crusade had stalled, morale was crumbling, and disease stalked the camps. What they needed was a leader who could break the deadlock. And Richard delivered. Despite suffering from scurvy and fever, he immediately took command. With siege towers, crossbowmen, and unmatched discipline, Richard launched relentless assaults. Within a month, Acre fell. His name was once again etched into history, not just as a crusader, but as a legend whose fierce leadership was second to none. After the surrender of Acre, Richard's actions became as ruthless as they were legendary. The Muslim defenders of Acre surrendered, and the city's gates creaked open. But the real drama began after the surrender. Richard demanded an enormous ransom from Saladin, 200,000 gold dinars, the release of Christian prisoners, and the return of the True Cross, the sacred relic lost during the disastrous Battle of Hattin. Saladin hesitated. He stalled. Negotiations dragged on. Richard's patience finally snapped. On the 20th of August, 1191, Richard ordered the execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners, including women and children. They were marched outside the city walls and slaughtered in full view of Saladin's army. The message was unmistakable. Richard would not be played with. He dealt in action, not diplomacy. The massacre sent shockwaves across the Holy Land. Crusaders were stunned, and Saladin, known for his chivalry, was enraged, but he did not retaliate with the same brutality. Instead, he continued to treat captured Christians with mercy, perhaps to draw contrast with the bloodthirsty Lionheart. The horror at Acre set the tone for the rest of Richard's campaign. He was both a hero and a terror. To Christian knights, he was the embodiment of medieval virtue, fearless, devout, and unyielding. To Muslims, he was a beast in human armor. Despite this dark stain, Richard's military genius was undeniable. After Acre, Richard reorganized the Crusader forces, repaired their fractured morale, and began marching south toward Jaffa, aiming to threaten Jerusalem itself. But Jerusalem was more than a military target. It was a symbol. And while Richard won battles on the ground, he was slowly losing a greater war, one of distance, loyalty, and time. Back in England and France, his enemies were beginning to move, and the longer he stayed in the east, the more vulnerable his crown became. But Richard didn't care not yet, for now the Lionheart had blood to spill and holy ground to reclaim. With Acre behind him and the road to Jerusalem open, Richard's crusade seemed unstoppable. Victories followed quickly. In September 1191, he won the Battle of Ars, defeating Saladin's elite forces with tactical brilliance. While most Crusader leaders would have crumbled under a desert ambush, Richard adapted, flanked, and countercharged with terrifying precision. His command on the battlefield was almost supernatural. He inspired loyalty, fear, and awe in equal measure. By winter, the Crusader army stood within sight of Jerusalem. Yet, despite being on the verge of taking the holy city, Richard hesitated. Taking Jerusalem wasn't just a matter of military strength, it involved logistics, supply lines, and weather. The rainy season turned roads into rivers of mud, making siege engines useless. Worse still, Saladin's army shadowed every move, waiting for a mistake. But the real reason for Richard's doubt ran deeper. He knew that even if he took the city, he couldn't hold it. The Crusader states were too fractured, their allies too unreliable, and Richard had no intention of staying in the Holy Land forever. Without reinforcements, Jerusalem would simply fall back into Muslim hands once he left. For a man obsessed with lasting glory, a fleeting conquest wasn't enough. So, in early 1192, Richard made the fateful decision to turn back. It was a decision that stunned his men. They had marched for years, spilled oceans of blood, and come within arm's reach of the holiest city in Christendom, only to retreat. Richard justified it as strategy. Others whispered of cowardice, exhaustion, or perhaps a rare moment of humility. Either way, Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands. But the campaign wasn't over. Richard still had unfinished business. He recaptured Jaffa, securing it from Saladin's forces. Though the Crusaders had failed to take Jerusalem, Richard's brilliance in battle, his unwavering determination, and his ruthlessness would cement his place in history as one of the most legendary kings to ever walk the earth. After months of intense battle and a hard-won truce with Saladin, Richard the Lionheart's greatest enemy became the treacherous forces back home. Richard's campaign in the Holy Land came to an end with a truce in September 1192. He had failed to reclaim Jerusalem, but had preserved Christian influence in the region. The Treaty of Jaffa allowed Christian pilgrims to visit the Holy City freely, and the Crusader states retained a thin strip of coastal land. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. Richard had done his best, but the weight of the Holy Land's conquest was not to be his. As Richard set sail home, he knew the fight wasn't over new. Enemies awaited him. Not in the east, but in Europe itself. While Richard had been focused on Christendom, his own brother, Prince John, had been scheming to seize the throne. The Lionheart was now heading toward an entirely different battlefield, one where his family would prove to be his greatest adversary. In late 1192, Richard began the long journey back to England. However, storms, illness, and political enemies turned his return into a nightmare. While sailing through the Adriatic Sea, Richard's fleet was forced ashore. He tried to travel incognito through Central Europe, disguised as a humble pilgrim, but it didn't work. He was recognized near Vienna by agents of Duke Leopold of Austria, a man Richard had humiliated during the Crusade by tearing down his banner from the walls of Acre. Leopold, nursing his old grudge, arrested the king and passed him along to Emperor Henry VI of the Holy Roman Empire. Suddenly, Richard, the warrior king of England, the Lionheart, was a prisoner in a cold German dungeon. The news of his capture shocked Europe. Kings weren't supposed to be treated like this, especially not when they were alive. The idea of a king being held hostage was almost unfathomable. But Henry VI saw an opportunity. He demanded an outrageous ransom, 150,000 marks, more than double England's annual income. To pay it, every church, village, and noble in England was squeezed dry. The kingdom groaned under the weight of taxes, and even the royal crown jewels were pawned. Back in England, the real danger wasn't just the ransom, it was Prince John, Richard's younger brother. John had begun plotting with King Philip II of France to seize the throne. He spread rumours that Richard was dead and made moves to take power, seizing castles, forging alliances, and bribing officials. England stood on the brink of civil war. But Eleanor of Aquitaine, Richard's formidable mother, acted swiftly. She rallied loyal nobles, negotiated with the emperor, and kept John contained. When the ransom was finally paid in February 1194, Richard was released to thunderous celebration. Asked what he'd do about John, Richard famously quipped, "I forgive him, and let him wait for my inheritance." It was a classic Lionheart response, sharp, sardonic, and vengeful beneath the surface. Though Richard had spent barely 6 months in England during his entire reign, the people still saw him as their heroic king, returned from captivity like a biblical figure. But Richard wasn't back for peace, he was back for war with France. The crusade was over, and now the battlefield would be his own backyard. Richard may have returned to England as a free man, but he had no intention of staying there. Within weeks of his release, he crossed the Channel once again, not to reclaim holy ground, but to defend his French territories against a familiar foe, King Philip II of France. The two former Crusade allies were now bitter enemies. Richard the Lionheart, a man who had defied fate at every turn, was brought low not by an empire-shattering battle, but by a single crossbow bolt. Richard's imprisonment, the seizing of castles, and the rebellion across Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine consumed the years following his return to England. Richard, humiliated and enraged, launched himself into battle with renewed fury. Between 1194 and 1199, the war between the Plantagenet and Capetian realms raged, with Richard waging an almost ceaseless campaign of sieges, raids, and ambushes across France. He personally led his knights into battle, stormed enemy strongholds, and rebuilt castles with astonishing speed. His favourite project, the mighty Château Gaillard, a fortress perched high over the Seine River in Normandy, became an iconic symbol of Richard's military genius. Strong and modern, it was said to be impregnable. Richard, so proud of his creation, called it "my fair daughter," boasting that he could hold it even if its walls were made of butter. This was Richard at his most focused and formidable. No longer chasing relics in Jerusalem, he now waged a deeply personal war to restore the lands his father had ruled and punish the kings who dared defy him. Meanwhile, his brother John, humbled and reconciled with Richard, swore loyalty in exchange for forgiveness. But the true battle for Richard was not just against France, it was against time. Years of war, imprisonment, and crusading had aged him. Though he suffered from bouts of fever and exhaustion, he never backed down. In public, he laughed, rode, and drank like a conqueror. In private, his body was failing, and he knew it. Still, the war pushed on. In early 1199, Richard, while laying siege to a minor rebel stronghold at Chalus-Chabrol in central France, a petty fortress of little strategic value, took a final risk. Bold as always, Richard removed his helmet and approached the walls on horseback to inspect the defences. From that wall, a single crossbow bolt flew, striking him in the shoulder. The wound seemed minor at first, but within days, infection set in. Richard began to burn with fever, and his skin blackened. The Lionheart, who had survived crusades, captivity, and countless battles, was now slowly being brought down by a simple wound, inflicted by a nameless boy defending a forgotten castle. The irony was thick. After surviving sieges, poisoned plots, and imperial prisons, Richard's reign was ending not in a glorious battle, but over a minor rebellion in an unimportant corner of France. Knowing his death was near, Richard prepared himself. He summoned his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, now in her 70s, to be by his side. In one of their final conversations, she held his hand, a mother comforting a son who had been forged in steel but was now melting away. Richard made peace with his brother John, naming him heir, a choice that would haunt England in the coming years. In an act of mercy, Richard ordered that the boy who shot him be spared and rewarded. However, his mercenaries defied the order, and in a brutal final act, they flayed the boy alive, a savage punctuation to a blood-soaked rain. On the 6th of April, 1199, Richard the Lionheart died. His body, divided in death as it had been in life, was buried in several places. His heart in Rouen, his brain in Poitou, and his body at Fontevraud Abbey, beside his father, Henry II, whom he had once rebelled against and ultimately succeeded. Even in death, Richard straddled the fractured territories of a crumbling empire. His reign had lasted only 10 years, and he had spent less than 6 months of it in England. He spoke little English, raised heavy taxes, and left the kingdom deeply in debt. Yet, despite it all, Richard was remembered almost as a legend, more than a king. The legend of Richard the Lionheart continued to grow after his death, but it was not only his courage and strength that lived on his very name, became synonymous with the ideal of medieval kingship. Richard's legacy was cemented almost immediately as a hero. He embodied the ideals of medieval kingship: bravery, chivalry, strength, and uncompromising will. His legend grew, exaggerated by chroniclers and poets who painted him not as he was, but as he was needed to be. In the centuries that followed, his tomb became a place of myth, and his name became a byword for courage. Richard the Lionheart was no saint, but he died as he lived, sword drawn, heart blazing, and always riding into the fire. But while legends like Richard's endure, some stories defy all logic and comprehension. A strange and inexplicable event would take place in the summer of 1518, one that would be whispered about for generations. It began with a single woman. On a blisteringly hot morning in July of 1518, in the bustling medieval city of Strasbourg, a woman named Fra Trofa stepped into the street and began to dance. Not to music, not at a festival. She wasn't drunk or celebrating. She simply started to move rhythmically, relentlessly, without smiling, without speaking. Witnesses say she looked distressed, arms flailing, sweat pouring down her face, her shoes slapping the stones as she spun and jerked with unnatural energy. Neighbors watched in confusion. Some laughed nervously, assuming it was a joke. But the joke didn't end. She danced for hours, then through the night, and then into the next day. No one could stop her. Her husband pleaded. Clerics watched. Physicians scratched their heads, but she kept going, her eyes wild, her body trembling, her feet blistering. Eventually, she collapsed from exhaustion, only to get back up and keep dancing. By the 3rd day, a small crowd gathered, not of spectators, but fellow dancers, as if something had taken root in the town's mind. Within a week, dozens had joined Herman, women, even children spinning, leaping, twitching uncontrollably. The square in Strasbourg turned from a marketplace into a dance floor of panic. There was no music, no joy, just bodies trapped in motion. Civic leaders were stunned. This was no festival. These people weren't celebrating, they were suffering. Some were foaming at the mouth. Others screamed prayers as they spun. Many cried for help, yet none could stop. And worst of all, no one understood why. Was it a curse? Was it a sickness? Or something far stranger? Instead of quarantining the dancers, the city council took the opposite approach. They encouraged more dancing, believing the dancers would recover if they simply danced it out. They hired musicians, opened guild halls, and even built a stage. What followed was chaos. The crowd swelled to nearly 100 dancers. Some collapsed from exhaustion, others from strokes or heart attacks. And still, the dance went on. The people of Strasbourg had never seen anything like it. They were witnessing a city possessed not by demons or disease, but by something that had no name, no explanation, and no mercy. Whatever it was that began with Fra Trofa, it had just begun. By the 2nd week of the outbreak, Strasbourg had ceased to function like a normal medieval city. Bakers, blacksmiths, and merchants stopped work just to watch the bizarre procession unfold in the city square. The dancers kept coming, sometimes in small groups, sometimes alone, and none of them could explain what was happening. When asked, they wept. Some claimed they felt invisible hands forcing their limbs to move. Others said their minds were consumed by the rhythm, unable to control their own bodies. The entire city was caught in a feverish, hypnotic trance. What had begun as one woman's strange, uncontrollable dance turned into a public crisis, the likes of which Strasbourg had never seen before. The city was trapped, watching helplessly as its people performed a painful, endless ballet. By now, over 100 people had been swept up in the madness. Some were bruised and bleeding. Others had collapsed and were carried away, only to return hours later with their feet bandaged, still dancing. The strange affliction showed no signs of slowing. Physicians of the day offered no real comfort. The leading theory was hot blood. According to the medical beliefs of the time, an overheated heart could cause excessive motion and mania. The cure? Let the body exhaust itself. So, in an act of chilling irony, the city officials hired musicians and professional dancers. They constructed a wooden stage in the square and set up tents to shelter the dancers from the heat. They hoped, madly, that the solution was more dancing. The result was catastrophic. The music intensified the frenzy. Drummers pounded rhythms that echoed through the streets like war signals. Fiddlers played until their fingers ached. The dancers surged in number and ferocity. Some writhed on the ground as if possessed. Others leaped so violently they dislocated joints or struck their heads on nearby walls. By the third week, the toll of the dance was undeniable. People began dying. Accounts speak of heart attacks, strokes, exhaustion, and even people dropping dead mid-spin, only to be stepped over by the still-moving crowd. There was no mass grave, no ritual for the fallen, only more music, more sweat, and more suffering. Behind the horror, the city's leaders whispered of supernatural causes. Some believed the dancers were cursed by Saint Vitus, the patron saint of epilepsy and madness. Others suspected demonic possession, or worse, divine punishment for some unspoken sin festering within Strasbourg. But one thing was clear: this was no longer a strange woman in the street. It was a public crisis, one with no precedent and no end in sight. And still, the people danced. As the dancers spun themselves into unconsciousness and death, secular solutions failed. The stage, the music, and the dance it out approach only fanned the flames. The people of Strasbourg turned to the only institution left that might make sense of the madness: the church. By August 1518, a month into the plague, local clergy declared the phenomenon a spiritual affliction. The medical theories of hot blood were cast aside. What they now faced, they said, was not a disease of the body, but of the soul. The prevailing theory was that the dancers were victims of Saint Vitus's curse. According to medieval belief, Saint Vitus, a 4th century Christian martyr, had the power to punish sinners with uncontrollable movement. Those who angered him through vanity, blasphemy, or secret sins could be struck with convulsions, trembling, and violent rhythmic spasms. It wasn't a new idea. Earlier outbreaks of similar dancing plagues had been reported in places like Aachen and Metz, but never on this scale, and never with this level of terror. The church's solution was drastic: pilgrimage and penance. The city's clergy ordered that the dancers be removed from Strasbourg. Many were transported half-conscious to the shrine of Saint Vitus in the nearby town of Saven, carried by cart or slumped over pack animals. Once there, the afflicted were dressed in red shoes, each with a holy cross painted on the sole. They were led around the shrine in ritual circles, prayed over, sprinkled with holy water, and made to place offerings before the saints' relics. A few reportedly recovered, but for most, the dance continued to possess them until the very end. The mystery of the dancing plague of 1518 remains one of the most baffling and eerie events in history, an epidemic of uncontrollable motion that seized an entire town, its cause still debated by historians to this day. The dancing stopped almost as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a city filled with questions and a lingering sense of dread. Recovered dancers collapsed and were left behind. Back in Strasbourg, the church ordered a citywide spiritual cleansing. Gambling was banned. Blasphemy was punishable by fine. Secular music was prohibited. Public dancing was outlawed. Sermons thundered from pulpits, warning of divine wrath. Citizens were urged to confess sins, perform acts of charity, and renounce temptation. The city became a place of hush and fear, as if trying to cover up the noise and frenzy that had overtaken it. And slowly, Almost inexplicably, the dancing began to stop. No one declared the end. There was no final waltz, just fewer dances each day, and silence returned to the square. Then, as suddenly as it began, the streets of Strasbourg stood still again. But the questions had only just begun. When the dancing finally stopped, Strasbourg didn't breathe a sigh of relief. It held its breath, because no one understood what had just happened. There was no invading army, no natural disaster, no visible enemy. And yet, hundreds had danced uncontrollably, some until their hearts gave out. The city returned to its routines, but the memory of that summer haunted everyone. Years passed, but whispers remained. What if it returned? What if the curse was sleeping, not gone? Centuries later, historians and psychologists began combing through the records. And one theory emerged that seemed to match the madness mass psychogenic illness, also known as mass hysteria. Mass hysteria occurs when a group of people under extreme psychological stress begins to manifest symptoms without any physical cause. In modern terms, it's the mind overrunning the body, multiplied across an entire community. Think fainting spells in school dormitories or phantom illnesses spreading in a closed workplace. But in medieval Strasbourg, it may have taken the form of a dance to death. The theory makes sense when you consider the pressure cooker that was 1518. The region had been hammered by famine, plague, and social unrest. People were starving. Dozens of children had recently died in a crop failure. The political and religious landscape was unraveling. The Protestant Reformation loomed, and fear of hellfire was at an all-time high. Add to that the belief in curses, saints, and divine punishment, and you had a society teetering on the edge. So when Frau Trofa began to dance, people may have seen not just a woman, but a warning. Their minds, primed by trauma, followed her lead. Supporters of the hysteria theory point to similar outbreaks. Groups of nuns who barked like dogs, towns where people believed they'd been bitten by invisible animals, villages where laughter or screaming became contagious. In each case, there was no toxin, no infection, just shared belief and shared fear. Still, even the mass hysteria theory doesn't explain everything. Why did some people dance until their bodies gave out? Why did only certain towns experience this and not others under equal pressure? It might offer a framework, but not closure. Because, as logical as the explanation sounds, Strasbourg in 1518 didn't follow logic, it followed rhythm and madness. For those unconvinced by the mass hysteria explanation, another theory emerged, one rooted in biology rather than psychology. Could the dancing plague have been caused not by fear or superstition, but by poison, specifically a fungal toxin called ergot? The theory of ergot poisoning, while compelling, is still a mystery in its own right, but it fits the strange symptoms seen in Strasbourg in 1518. Ergot is a parasitic fungus that grows on rye and other grains during warm, damp summers, the exact conditions present in Strasbourg in 1518. When consumed, it produces alkaloid toxins that can trigger vivid hallucinations, convulsions, twitching, and sensations of crawling under the skin. It's chemically similar to LSD, the psychedelic drug synthesized centuries later. And ergotism, as the poisoning is called, was well known in medieval Europe. It was often referred to as Saint Anthony's fire because of the burning sensations victims experienced in their limbs. Could ergot-tainted bread have sparked the outbreak? At first glance it fits. The symptoms jerking limbs, hallucinations, and lack of control align eerily with the descriptions of the dancers in Strasbourg. The idea that entire communities could unknowingly consume contaminated grain and then begin to move erratically in unison sounds plausible, especially in an era when food shortages meant even mouldy bread would not go to waste. But the theory has problems. Ergotism usually causes convulsions and stiffness, not dancing. Victims are more likely to collapse into spasms or suffer seizures, not maintain coordinated rhythmic movement for days. Also, ergotism tends to cause gangrene and vomiting, long before inducing any form of energetic behavior. There are no contemporary reports of blackened limbs, vomiting blood, or other classic ergot symptoms in Strasbourg. Then there's geography. If ergot-tainted bread was the cause, why didn't nearby towns eating from the same grain sources experience similar outbreaks? Why was it so specific to Strasbourg? Still, some researchers argue for a combination. Mild ergot poisoning sparking neurological symptoms in a population already pushed to the brink by starvation and fear. Perhaps the fungus dulled inhibition. Perhaps it blurred the line between vision and reality, setting the stage for a psychological wildfire. It's a fascinating idea, a toxin in the daily bread becoming a chemical conductor for communal madness. But like all the theories surrounding the dancing plague, it lacks one thing: certainty. Because whatever tainted Strasbourg that summer, whether mold or mind, it struck with the force of something older, something primal. And it didn't stop with bread. To truly understand the dancing plague, we have to step inside the minds of the people who lived through it. And that means entering a world where fear, faith, and folklore were indistinguishable from fact. In 1518, Europe was not merely struggling with famine and disease. It was spiritually anxious. Life was short, violent, and often inexplicable. The average person believed their suffering came not from bacteria or psychology, but from divine punishment or supernatural wrath. The church dominated every aspect of life. People prayed to saints for rain, for fertility, for healing, and especially for protection. But that devotion came with fear. If saints could heal, they could also curse. And none were more feared in this regard than St. Vitus. He was the saint most associated with involuntary movement and convulsions. Tales of St. Vitus's dance had circulated since the Middle Ages. Accounts of people struck by his displeasure, dancing uncontrollably until they collapsed. It was believed he could possess the body, twist it into spasms, and drag the sinner through madness until they were cleansed or dead. So when Fra Tropha began her strange performance in the street, the community's beliefs about St. Vitus's curse would have been a deeply ingrained and immediate association. The people of Strasbourg didn't reach for science, they reached for saints and stories, and folklore did the rest. At the time, rumours of spiritual contagion were widespread. It was believed that seeing someone cursed could spread the curse, a kind of medieval psychological contagion. If a single person was afflicted, and their community feared the same fate, it could spark a chain reaction, especially in an emotionally frail population. People might have danced not because they were physically compelled, but because their minds, soaked in myth and superstition, convinced them it was happening. The belief was powerful enough to override the body's natural limits. In this view, the dancing wasn't just an expression of fear, it was the fear. Even the city's solution, pilgrimage to St. Vitus's shrine, was steeped in this mindset. People believed that by physically reenacting rituals, wearing red shoes, and offering coins, they could reset the curse. And in some cases, it seemed to work. But if belief could cure, it could also harm. In 1518, belief was not optional. It was the framework through which every cough, shadow, and twitch was interpreted. And when belief breaks from reason, reality follows. Strasbourg's dancing plague wasn't an isolated case. It was simply the most infamous. Across medieval Europe, similar outbreaks had been recorded decades, even centuries earlier. The phenomenon had a name long before 1518, the chorea, meaning dance in Greek. One of the earliest known episodes occurred in Aachen in the year 1374, over a century before Strasbourg. In that case, crowds of people reportedly danced through the streets for days. They screamed, hallucinated, and claimed they couldn't control their limbs. Much like Strasbourg, the clergy blamed divine punishment, and the afflicted were led to churches for healing rituals. Then there was Metz, Cologne, Utrecht, all cities that saw similar events unfold. Groups of people dancing, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, and often begging for help. Some dropped from exhaustion, others foamed at the mouth. The reactions from authorities were always the same. Pray harder, march them to the nearest shrine, and hope they stopped. The fact that Strasbourg wasn't alone only deepens the mystery. What was this force that could cross generations and borders, slipping into different towns, always with the same eerie rhythm? Some scholars have argued these outbreaks followed patterns. Regions under stress, war, plague, famine were more likely to be affected. And significantly, the victims were often poor, deeply religious, and isolated from secular education. Their worldview offered few tools for interpreting distress. So, they danced, they twitched, they screamed. There's even a theory that these episodes were a form of cultural protest, a way for powerless people to express suffering in the only language available spectacle. In a society where speaking out against the church or the ruling class could get you killed, a strange illness might have been the safest way to scream. Of course, no one theory fits them all. Some cases seem linked to ergot poisoning. Others appear to be group panic. A few were probably misidentified epilepsy or neurological disease. But what binds them is how they were treated, not as medical events, but as moral and spiritual crises. Strasbourg was just the most tragic, most well-documented case, but it wasn't the first, and it may not have been the last. We like to think such madness belongs to the past, that we're too modern for that now. But when fear spreads faster than facts, history has a way of dancing back. The idea of mass hysteria, though rarely acknowledged today, is a reminder that even in the modern world, belief can push a population into madness. Hundreds of people dancing themselves to death sounds almost fictional today, like a dark fairy tale from a forgotten age. But the truth is, the human mind hasn't changed as much as we think. And the question modern historians and psychologists keep asking is chilling. Could it happen again? Some say it already has. In the 20th and 21st centuries, there have been documented cases of mass psychogenic illness that echo the strangeness of the Strasbourg plague. In 1962, at a boarding school in Tanganyika, now Tanzania, a mysterious outbreak of laughter spread through dozens of students. It wasn't joyful. It was compulsive, uncontrollable, and in some cases lasted for days. The school had to be shut down. There was no disease, no drug, no poison, just a social contagion. More recently, in 2006, several girls in a high school in New York developed tics, spasms, and verbal outbursts. Panic spread. Parents suspected environmental toxins, mold, vaccines, anything. But after months of investigation, doctors concluded it was mass psychogenic illness, likely sparked by stress, trauma, or even social media exposure. These modern plagues may look different from Strasbourg's frenzy dancers, but the mechanics are eerily similar. Intense stress, shared belief, and the body reacting without a clear cause. What we learn from Strasbourg is not just about the fragility of medieval minds, but the fragility of all minds. Human beings are wired to respond to fear. When the world feels unstable, when systems break down, when authority seems uncertain, our brains look for escape valves. Sometimes that's panic, sometimes it's illness, and sometimes it's dance. The danger today may not be in cobblestone town squares, but in digital ones. Online fear spreads in milliseconds. Misinformation moves faster than medieval rumors ever could. One viral video, one false claim, one moment of group panic, and you could see the seeds of a modern hysteria bloom before anyone can stop it. So, while we may never again see villagers collapsing from dance in cathedral courtyards, the psychology of Strasbourg is far from dead. It's just waiting for the right stage, the right audience, and the right spark. And when it comes, the rhythm may sound a little different, but the madness, it'll feel hauntingly familiar. Centuries have passed since the cobblestones of Strasbourg echoed with the desperate footsteps of the dancers. No more stages are built, no musicians are summoned, and yet the questions remain. Why did they dance? Was it a madness of the mind, a sickness of the blood, or the wrath of a forgotten saint? The dancing plague of 1518 resists a single explanation because it sits in the shadowy place between history and myth, between science and superstition. It wasn't a war. It wasn't a plague of rats or fleas or fire. It was something far more unnerving, a breakdown in human control. A city watching its people lose mastery over their own bodies, not once, but collectively, voluntarily yet helplessly. There are records, parish notes, city council decrees, eyewitness accounts, and yet all of them are fragments seen through the filter of a time when saints and demons were part of daily vocabulary. We can try to interpret them with modern logic, overlay theories like mass hysteria or mouldy bread, but in doing so, we risk flattening the strange truth of what happened. Because maybe the real horror isn't that people danced uncontrollably, but that they believed they had no choice. They had no choice. And perhaps we still carry that same fear. Think of the way panic spreads today, the way fear goes viral. One scream in a crowd can start a stampede. One headline can crash a market. One delusion, well-timed and well-placed, can set an entire population spiraling. We are still vulnerable not to Saint B, Vitus perhaps, but to the unseen forces of belief, stress, and contagion. Strasbourg becomes more than just a historical curiosity. It becomes a mirror. In that summer of 1518, the dancing eventually stopped. No fanfare, no final dancer to mark the end, just silence. People went back to their lives. Bakers baked again, churches reopened, markets bustled, but nothing was quite the same. The square where they danced is still there, quiet now. Tourists pass through. Few know what happened beneath their feet, fewer still understand it. But every so often, someone remembers, and for a moment, you can almost hear it. The echo of footfalls, the murmurs of the crowd, the sound of a violin playing for no one. This final segment of the story brings Strasbourg's tragedy into the present, linking historical events to modern psychological patterns and social contagion. It concludes with a poignant reflection, offering a timeless connection between past and present, as the dancing plague lingers in the collective unconscious.